Hello and welcome back to the Growth Equation podcast. Farewell. I'm Clay Skipper, joined by Brad Stulberg, Steve Magness. We had an exciting event occur over the weekend. The Growth Equation family, Brad, competed in a powerlifting competition in Monroe, North Carolina. So Brad, tell us how it went. How was your experience over there with the powerlifters?
Oh, it was a phenomenal experience. I definitely have the itch. I underperformed my goals, which was mildly frustrating, but not as frustrating as it's been in the past in sport, which is something that we're going to talk a lot about later on today. But that aside, the entire experience was just great. It was my first time since high school football competing in a sport where you want to channel all those nerves and excitement and just go. I had a long stint. Longtime listeners of the Growth Equation will know in endurance sports, nowhere near the level of Steve or even you, Clay. But in those sports, you really want to let the race come to you, and it's about tampering that excitement and winding it up over time. Whereas in powerlifting, the entire lift takes anywhere between 1 and 2 seconds. So it's like, get all this adrenaline, get it, fight the bear. And then what I didn't know is that a powerlifting meet takes 8 to 9 hours. So I'm doing 9 attempts if you do all 3 exercises. I only did 2 of the movements, push-pull. So I'm doing 6 attempts over 9 hours. And just managing energy to get up to a peak state and then immediately come down, be able to eat in between over the course of a day. When it was time for me to deadlift, I had just eaten a barbecue chicken sandwich and mac and cheese. I was ready for a nap. And the woman, one of the 2 women that were coaching me at the meet, just comes over with 2 Celsius energy drinks. I've never had one of these in my life. She's like, drink these both now. So then I chug these 2 Celsius energy drinks. Next thing I know, I'm like bouncing off the walls to go deadlift. So it's just such a different experience than like showing up to the gym to max test your strength. It's really almost an entirely different sport. So yeah, I did not perform nearly as well as I wanted to, but I had 10 times more fun than I thought I would.
What was with the timing of that meal?
I showed up to the meet at 9 a.m. My first lift didn't occur till about noon. And I did have a lot of nerves and I didn't have much of an appetite. And I was concerned that if I ate a solid meal, like it was just going to come back up or I wasn't going to digest it. So I had this plan that I was going to have a fairly big breakfast at 8 a.m., which I did, and then just eat like Sour Patch Kids throughout the day. So just like ride sugar, almost like you're competing in an iron distance triathlon, right? Goos and sugar. So I did my bench presses between 12 and 1:30. And then 2 o'clock rolls around and all I've eaten is Sour Patch Kids. And apparently like I just didn't look very good. So again, these 2 women that are coaching me, they're like, you need to go eat. So there's a food truck outside. So you're not allowed to leave the venue to go to a grocery store. So what do? I go to the food truck, and what is the food truck? It's barbecue. So I get a barbecue chicken sandwich and mac and cheese. And I take that down, and I feel great for like 25 minutes, and then I am just ready to nap. Like I'm worried about being able to drive home without falling asleep. And now I'm supposed to try to deadlift 530 pounds in that condition. So that's when, again, these 2 women that were coaching me come up to me and they say, you also look good, but not the way that we want you to, so drink these energy drinks. And now with this experience under my belt, I realize that powerlifting is, again, so different than showing up at the gym and maxing out. And a huge part of the sport is managing energy and adrenaline, and as Steve would say, like general arousal over 9 hours. And I was ill prepared for that, and it showed. But I love the challenge of it, and it makes me want to try to get better at that component. Like it's its own component of the sport.
I'm thinking of how in marathon training, they're like, never try anything new on race day. And Brad was like, all right, on competition day, I'm going to have a barbecue chicken sandwich, some mac and cheese, and 2 Celsius, which I've never had either, but I hear basically 4 Loco or something.
Brad is taking me back in the day to when I got my start high school coaching, and you're at a track meet for, 10 hours, and kids do the stupidest things with their eating. And this is Brad. This is high school freshman, who's never been to the varsity track meet and needing to run 3 races. And you're like, what did you eat? Well, I've just had some Sour Patch Kids, and then I slammed a, hot dog beforehand. Love those days.
The other thing that was cool about it is in powerlifting, they have 2 divisions. They have a drug tested division and a non-drug tested division. i.e. a steroid division. And both divisions are like their own kind of separate communities, and there's no disrespect between the two. But you wouldn't ever show up on steroids at a non-drug tested because it's like you're a tool. Like if you want to use steroids, that's fine. In this community, go compete in the steroid division. And as a result of that, I was at a state championship meet. A couple national records got broke. Like Charlotte itself has a huge powerlifting community. So there were some very strong men and women. In the decent Spidey sense, not as good as Steve, but I think everyone was clean. Or if not, maybe like one or two people might have been doping. But even then, no one was doing things that seemed impossible. And putting on my journalist hat, I talked to the meet director. I'm asking him all these questions like, oh yeah, like, you know, we've got the non-drug tested meet next week. And like, you'll get to see the superhuman things happen then. And it goes back to a piece that Malcolm Gladwell wrote, I think in the New Yorker like 9 years ago, which is we should just have divisions where we allow steroids and divisions where we don't, and it might solve all the problems. And I don't want to be naive. There are probably some people that are like sneaking in some, you know, anti-aging therapies that they convince are legal even though they're not. But in general, I think drug-tested powerlifting is probably one of the cleaner sports in America because there's a non-drug tested division and those people don't feel less than or ashamed to do steroids. They do steroids proudly and they compete in their own class. That's just interesting to see all these clean people.
It sounds like there was a nice sense of camaraderie among the competitors. And in fact, you had a conversation with someone there, right? That's going to inform what we talk about today about motivation and being able to get in the zone and sort of how identity relates to your athletic pursuits or fitness pursuits.
That's right. So I'm going to tee this up. And I would say that even if you're not into fitness or sport, I think this is just as true for a musician or an artist or even like an attorney or a business person. So today we're going to talk about identity in pursuit or activity fusion and different ways to get there. And the genesis of this is I'm at the powerlifting meet and somebody, and I'm going to call her Amy, that's not her real name to protect her identity, shared with me that she'd really been struggling in sport for the last couple months. And she's a national class lifter, so significantly better than I am. And what she said is that for a long time, powerlifting was the one place in her life where she felt like she was making a lot of progress and felt like she belonged and felt really good. She's going through a super challenging breakup, was struggling with some professional career stuff, some family stuff, and as a result had like a lot of turbulence in her life and also a lot of personal insecurity about her self-worth. And in powerlifting, she excelled and she was great. And she found that validation in sense of confidence, insecurity, and predictability. And it made her a national class powerlifter. And she had no problem bearing herself and staying motivated to train. And then to get up and compete, well, when she got under the bar, like her identity is on the line. So she's going to give everything to make the lift because like that's her sense of self-worth and validation. Well, over the last couple of months, things in the rest of her life have been really good. She's finally found this job that feels like it's really challenging her and she enjoys. She's in a relationship that feels stable. Her mental health is really good. And the result of the rest of her life getting so much better is that her powerlifting has gotten a lot worse. And what she shared with me is for the longest time, she had no choice but to like go crush it in powerlifting because if not, then she might have spiraled into depression. But now that everything's good, it's kind of like, well, where do I find the motivation from? Where do I find the intensity from? And I think there's two parts of this, right? There's where do I find the motivation to train from? And then when it's competition day, where do I find the intensity to flip the switch and go compete? And before turning it over to Steve, what I said that is easier to say and put words to, but hard to do, is I think when we train and when we perform, broadly speaking, in my mind, there's these two ways that we can get at it. One is from a place of fear or insecurity, which is I'm doing this because I'm going through a divorce, or I'm doing this because it's the one area of my life where I excel, or I'm doing this because I need to, otherwise my substance use disorder or addiction takes over. And as a result, when you go train, you've got the motivation. And then when you go compete, you give it your all because the drive home is going to suck if you miss it because it's your whole sense of self. The upside of that is it's really easy to flip the switch and go. The downside of that is if you miss the lift, you're going to feel like absolute crap and maybe really spiral even deeper. The other way to go about it is to do it from a place of like love and joy, where you're doing it from freedom and because you want to, not because you need to. I think what's hard is that if you spent your entire life or a long period of time getting good from a place of need, and now you no longer need that sport to become whole, how do you flip that switch? How do you turn it on? How do you get the motivation? How do you make that transition?
Before Steve jumps in, because I think I know Steve will have really interesting thoughts on this and on how to flip the switch, coming from both places. But when we first started the episode, Brad, you said you underperformed your goals and you were only mildly disappointed, which is different from the past. And you said that's something we're going to touch on in this episode. So it sounds like to me like you've noticed something about your own motivations, and it sounds like you almost think that I don't know exactly. I'm making an assumption here, and I want to hear what the actuality is. But it sounds like you're saying maybe you care less, and maybe that had to do somewhat with your performance.
I don't know if it had to do with my performance. We'll unpack that. It definitely had to do. It definitely had to do with the reaction to my performance. So I wanted to deadlift 540 pounds and I wanted to bench press 325. Okay. And I bench pressed 303 and I pulled 501. So pretty significant underperformance. And there are reasons for it. And I think energy, the equipment, the pause, and I'm not so secure. I'm going to retest in the gym again and chase those numbers. But I think that for me, yeah, like it just didn't matter as much, because I had my son there cheering me on. And when I missed the lifts, I actually think that was more important than when I made the lifts, because my son got to see me fail and be okay with it. And for a 6.5-year-old that struggles with losing, I'm actually glad that I didn't make all the lifts. That would not be good. So the real gold medal was like having those teaching moments with my kid. But yeah, I don't know. Like in the past, you know, I got into football. I wrote about this in Master of Change. The reason I got into sports to begin with is because I got beat up when I was in 7th grade. I was a nerd. My parents weren't going to let me play football. Some kid jumped me, some high school punk. I lost all sense of like confidence. And my parents were like, all right, like maybe the cost benefit of football is worth it because he'll get strong. So I spent my entire high school essentially playing football and getting really strong and good at football to protect the little 7th grader that got beat up. And then in college, this girl I thought I was going to marry broke my heart. I'm like, well, fuck, rather than feel all this pain, I might as well bury myself and get into endurance sports. That was my entry into triathlon. Powerlifting, I'm good, man. I love my wife. I love you guys. I love my job. I love my kids. I still want to do well, but like, it just doesn't matter as much. And that's new to me too.
So we got to kick Brad out of the podcast to get him angry and hitting those, outperforming his goals.
Oh man. Where to start with this? I mean, I think we're wrestling with the nuance of performance and like getting in the state to perform. I think it's nuanced because I think we often, I think Brad's right. Like you can generally perform out of a place of joy or a place out of fear. But I think it's even simpler than that. Meaning like that's the underlying motivation, but to a degree, like it doesn't really matter because like you're trying to get your physiology and your psychology in the right place. And you can do that, from fear, from joy, from anywhere in between, and still get to kind of the same place. And the example I like to give on these is like, just watch 100-meter sprinters, right? If you watch the Olympics, some of those athletes looked like they wanted to kill somebody on the starting line, right? They wanted to like, you look at them, you're like, oh dear God, that person wants to murder everyone else in the field. And then you look at, going back a little bit, but like Usain Bolt is like, doing his Bolt move and dapping up the young kid in the blocks and just like having a good time and laughing and joking before he runs 9.6 for 100, which is unbelievable, right? And I think that just kind of shows you that you can like get there through multiple ways. I think it's just kind of having your physiology, psychology, body all in there. And I guess from a standpoint, the way I like to look at this stuff is from friend of the growth equation, Dan John. I remember watching him coach decathletes and heptathletes once. And before every event, he'd walk up to this case, it was a female heptathlete, and he'd walk up and be like, "What's your number you need to be at, 1 through 10? And they'd say, for shot put, she'd be like a 9. And it'd be like, okay, how are you going to get to 9? Like, what strategies are you going to be going to? And then they'd go to, I don't know, the long jump. What do you need to be at? A 6, 1500, a 3, whatever it is, right? And all you're trying to do there is saying, like, where do I need my intensity or underlying physiological arousal to handle the demands in front of me? And once you kind of know that as your set point for you and the event you're taking on, then if you've learned the tricks of the trade, you use various tools to get there. It's why you can shift your focus of attention. Whenever I, felt like I needed to like get in the zone and get focused, I would take my glasses off so I was blind to the world and could only see like right in front of me. And that narrowing of focus made me literally narrowed my focus on like, hey, what matters is this right here, like this next step, this next stride, this next person you can get. And you're just using your focus to get there. You can also do it with like goals. This is where the fear or hate or, love or joy comes into play, right? I had one athlete who was kind of crazy, but he would say, somebody asked him, hey, what are you thinking about in the final 100 of the 800? And he said, that guy in front of me is trying to kill my mama. And, it's crazy, but that's his way of like getting in the right headspace he needed to be in. Do we all need to be in there? I've never been in a race and thought that, someone else was trying to kill my mama. But like, yeah. If that's the tactic that gets you in there, then like using it for the short term, like, yeah, there's probably some downsides to that. Maybe some therapy needed. I don't know. But it can get you in that spot. And I think to me, like what I always told and taught athletes is you got to know where you need to be for the event and yourself, right? The best answer to this is during practice and games or competitions is develop the tool sets where you can go any number of different ways, because sometimes they're going to work. Sometimes you're going to have to use something else. And you do that, you'll eventually figure out how to flip that switch when it matters.
So you're talking about in the moment, Steve. And I think that there's also over the long haul. So like the motivation to train and then to get to that moment and what you bring to that moment. And I think that those are things that are worth teasing apart, because for the ultra runner, and this is a very common caricature, for the ultra runner that got into the sport at a time of, maybe rock bottom and a substance use addiction, and it's been a big part of their recovery, and they just scratch that itch of masochism and pain in finding themselves in ultra running. And they had no problem running their 100-mile races, and everyone has a problem running a 100-mile race, but whatever, they could do it in their training and so on and so forth, because it was like filling this void that otherwise they were scared to face. And then that person, through other methods, gets more secure with themselves, and now that void is filled elsewhere, and they no longer need to fill it with ultra running. I think it is hard for a lot of people to stay in that sport with the same level of intensity. Like they have to find a whole new approach to it. Because getting up and in the zone, I have no problem with that. To your point, like I chug these energy drinks. I asked Cassie, one of these girls that was coaching me, to slap my back as hard as she could. And I just went out there and ripped. And I had enough nerves and adrenaline where like I was either going to freeze or go, and I didn't know how to respond. And thankfully I grew up playing competitive sports, and enough of my nervous system remembered to go, not freeze. And I went. So that was great. But it's the 6 months leading up to it where it's just like, I don't know how much it matters. And I think there's this paradox, because if it matters too much and your whole sense of self is on the line, we've talked about this, we've written about this, most people tend to underperform. But what if you go all the way And I'm curious what Clay will say coming off of a 10-day meditation retreat where he realized that everything's impermanent and nothing really matters and you're not attached. Well, then how do you get up at all if it doesn't matter? Because the truth is it doesn't matter. No one cares how much I power lift.
Yeah, but a good counterexample of that, and you're definitely overselling the amount of enlightenment I got on this 10-day meditation retreat. But a counterexample of that is, who am I going to say? A Farewell podcast guest, ultra runner, Courtney DeWalter, who seemed, I mean, granted, we only know what she tells us and who knows what's actually happening inside, but she said that thing about keeping joy in the front seat and seems to be someone who obviously takes it very seriously, but doesn't seem to take herself that seriously in doing it. And I think that is a good example of someone who doesn't seem to be motivated by insecurity or fear or having to do it, but really sees it as a get to do it, like a thing, a blessing. And she thrives in that mindset.
I think and that's a great addition, Clay. I think what you're getting at is it's not about we're not talking about flipping the switch. We're talking about underlying motivation. And I think what we have is we have this misconception that the underlying motivation should be in the same direction and the same intensity for life. And the reality is it's not. And that switching is natural and normal. There was a wonderful study a couple of years ago that looked at Olympic level swimmers, most of who had won some sort of medal at the Olympics. And they tracked them over their entire Olympic career. And what they found is that their motivational orientation switched. At first, it was very performance driven. And then at some point in their early to mid 20s, it switched from performance driven to quest driven, which quest driven is more of performance is more exploit. I'm going to exploit my talents, try to win that medal, blah, blah, blah. Quest is I'm going on exploration. I'm seeing what I can do. I'm seeing what the sport is all about. To Clay's point with Courtney DeWalter, I'm going to put joy in the front seat and just have fun with it. See what happens. Their performance, their overall performance, didn't suffer when they changed to quest driven. It just, the motivation that came with it shifted a little bit. And I think that's what we're getting at, is that it's not a flipping of the switch. It's just understanding that, there's a reorientation that often occurs as you move into, we'll call it, some degree of maturity in sport, where the importance or meaning of the sport itself or the endeavor shifts and changes. And I think it's up to you to decide, well, is this still important enough for me to pursue in this way? Because you can still reach the top in a quote unquote quest driven way or a joy driven way. Or am I going to make the choice that, I enjoy doing this sport, but I'm going to do it at 70% and be okay with it. And I think that's what we're getting at.
And sometimes I feel like that actually helps. I mean, it depends on the level you're at, obviously. But we've heard multiple people on the podcast, athletes we've interviewed, who've said that, I went out that race that day. I just was going to see what happened. And it ended up being the best performance. One of the best performances they've ever had. I was talking to a friend over the weekend, actually, who's a Nike running coach, and she's not coaching. She's just coaching everyday people who are running recreational marathons. But I was talking to her about it, and she was like, most of these people would benefit from just chilling the F out. They take their marathon training way too seriously. And if they were just a little bit more chill, they would actually run better because they'd be more relaxed. They wouldn't be so uptight about it. I know I've experienced that. And I don't know if, Steve, you've had that experience. You've obviously worked with much higher caliber athletes, but I feel like sometimes if you can get the athlete to just relax, it can actually, and have that mentality of let's see what happens rather than, oh my God, I have to do great, or I have to follow my plan to 100% to go exactly a T. It can actually backfire in a way because you're so rigid.
There was a wonderful example of that in this year's Olympics in the women's 1500. There was a British girl named Georgia Bell who won bronze in the 1500. And she has this fascinating story because she was like a phenom. At 14, she ran 2:08 in the 800, which for female is super fast at that age. Progressed a little bit, ran like 2:03 a couple years later, then went to the US NCAA system, got a scholarship, and just got hurt. Didn't enjoy the sport, quit the sport for like 4 years, started taking up triathlons, duathlons for fun, park runs, 5K fun runs, etc. Didn't take it seriously. And then came back and joined a British group when she was working full-time, I think, as a cybersecurity or something, computer science, something like that. Had a full-time job, just got back into training. And 2 years later, she has the British record in the 1500 and a bronze medal. And if you look at the interviews, if you talk to her coaches, which I know pretty well, Jenny Meadows and Trevor Painter, they put fun at the front seat, right?
Yeah.
Their group is like, hey, we're going to have fun, is essentially it. We're going to see what we can do. And for her, I think that taking that pressure off, that alleviating that, like, oh my God, I'm a prodigy who ran 2:08 at 14 and was competing at the national stage at that age, that freed her up to perform, and she had a full-time job. And I'm not saying that everybody's going to have that effect, but you often see that in especially neurotic distance runners who sometimes take a break, sometimes have a family, come back and, enjoy the sport because it's on their terms.
And that's essentially what I told this woman who we're going to call Amy, is just that, like, put my coach hat on and said, all right, well, it probably wasn't very hard for you to show up at the gym and train really well for 2 hours a day alone when you needed to feel okay in your own skin and just to survive. But now that you don't need to, maybe training alone for 2 hours isn't the right way to do it. Maybe you're never going to find motivation. Maybe you need to shift to training with a group. And yeah, that might mean that you're not going to get to train at the perfect time, or the workouts might not be the perfect length. You might not have the greatest equipment because now you're rotating. But part of the shift to joy and fun is training in a group environment where the group motivates you, where you don't have to go all internal for that motivation. The other thing is, I think that when we get into that more, I need to do well because my whole sense of security is on the line, we spend a lot of time thinking about our pursuit when we're not doing it. So we're sitting on the forums reading. We're obsessing over bad workouts, or we're replaying how well we did in good workouts. Like, it just encroaches and takes up more of our day. And it's easy to trick ourselves into thinking that by thinking or ruminating about our sport or our endeavor, it makes us better, when in fact, it doesn't do anything. And if anything, it makes us worse because we stress. And in a sport like powerlifting, it's essentially like, hey, if you can get in a group environment to have fun and push hard and train 4 days a week for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and then, make sure that you're hitting your protein, carbohydrate requirements. If you respond to creatine, make sure you take your creatine. And that's it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to think about the sport at all, and your performance won't get worse.
We're sort of presupposing in this conversation that people will always want to perform at the same level they are performing at. And maybe this is a period in Amy's life, or if someone else is listening and they're feeling a similar thing where they're like, my life's great. I no longer need to go on my 20-mile runs to get away from my family or whatever. And maybe it's just like, okay, then it doesn't need to have as big of a role in your life as maybe it did before. I think of that like the burners theory, where you have like your life, you have a stove and you have like your life burner and your work burner and your exercise burner, and you can't keep them on high all at the same time, right? And so maybe it's just like adjusting those burners. Maybe the exercise, sports, fitness, athletics burner gets turned down to medium or medium low, and everything else, family, gets turned up, So I think it's just always doing that dance of, to use your metaphor, Brad, I'm in a different room in my identity house, and I'm just going to spend a little more time in this room, that life, family room, and work room, and maybe less time in the exercise, athletics room. So I think there's also a conversation there of like, do you need to keep performing at the level you are at? Do you need to have as much motivation, or can this fill a different role for you?
And I think, what you're getting at is also the delineation between what I'd call like, performance numbers and like performance holistically. So to give you an example, Clay, I can go out tomorrow and give you a all-out performance that I'm proud of. But objectively, from a numbers standpoint, it's going to be nowhere near my best, right? But the performance is still there, right? And I think that's part of the shift, is like, sometimes we say, okay, the performance means like whatever, lift how much many numbers, run a mile at whatever speed, whatever it is. But to me, the shift is like performance is getting the most out of myself when I decide that like I'm going to do that thing. And I think when you make that shift, that allows you to, train at 50% and realize like, I'm not going to run a mile or lift as much weight as I would have if I was training at 100%, but I can still figure out a way how to get the most out of myself. And like that to me is like a more healthy, orientation over the long haul, because it also, allows you when you want to ramp up that burner to ramp it up, because you still, you can train more and you're still going after 100% performance. Just the numbers and metrics get a little bit better.
Also, to your point, performance and health they're not often not the same, right? Like I think
that's what I was going to say. They're different.
Like, if you're training for a marathon, probably not that healthy to be putting in 70-mile weeks necessarily, especially if you're doing it all year. I mean, you wouldn't all year round. That's how you get injured. I should speak for myself. Steve could probably do that in his sleep, but that is arguably not something that's good for your overall health.
I'm going to say that you're wrong and that you're right. There's a lot of research that shows that elite athletes, Steve's nodding, he knows where I'm going, at the tippy top of what they do, they actually outlive the general population. So this notion that like running 110 miles isn't good for your health is just not supported by evidence. There's actually a lot of studies in Norwegian winter sport endurance athletes, i.e. cross-country skiers and skaters. And unlike runners whose bodies break after a certain number of mileage, in those sports, you can train even more. And the data shows that they outlive the general population. So it's a misnomer that elite athletes it's not healthy. You could talk about mental health. And there, I'd say some elite athletes have great mental health and some elite athletes don't have great mental health. And they probably mirror the general population, because some people in the general population have good mental health, some don't. And most of us go through periods of everything. What I will say where you're right is that you don't need to train for performance to be healthy. You could go and take your dog on a 90-minute hike in the woods with some hills and be every bit as healthy than, or I shouldn't say every bit. I got to come back to the data. Elite athletes live longer. You could go take your dog on a walk over rolling hills and essentially be as healthy as the elite athlete. At the margin, maybe they live a little bit longer. But you're not making yourself less healthy by training for sport, but you don't need to train for sport to be healthy. But to your point, because it's another thing that I talked about with Amy, is maybe she's at a point of her life where she should just be taking those long rolling walks in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of Asheville and not spending any time in the gym. And the only thing that she'd be letting go is this part of her identity house. And she'd be remodeling that room, or maybe she'd be annexing that room. And there's nothing wrong with that.
I like the phrase remodeling, because like there's always a running room in Steve's house, but the decorations change, right? During my competitive career, maybe it's like trophies and like inspirational things that are about running faster. And like right now it's, a picture of Steve hammering with a stroller, just trying to feel what it's like to be fast and push again. And that's going to vary for everybody. Everything is relative. So what I think matters for Amy is what's relative, what is her relative, and what does she feel comfortable training at? And, maybe start there.
Yeah. And I think that I'm being biased because this is the answer that I've come to for now, and it will change, which is, I've got different seasons of life and different seasons even within a year, right? We're putting out a book, we're launching an academy, versus we're just kind of in steady state at work. Kids are off of school, kids are in school, all these different variables. And for me, it's I want to train as hard as possible. And it's really important to respect both parts of that sentence, the as hard part, but also the as possible part. And once those constraints are set, you just maximize it. And I think the nice thing about a sport like powerlifting, and maybe to some extent running, is that your body also defines the as possible. And more isn't more. It's not swimming. I think it'd be really hard for someone with a maximizer attitude to try to be a competitive swimmer at this stage of life, because in swimming, generally speaking, up to a pretty insane point, the more you swim, the better you get. But that's not true in running or powerlifting. So you just have to define what as possible is. And then I really think you got to find a community and a group to train in, because otherwise training at a fairly high level just becomes impossible unless you're doing it to fill some kind of void or identity hole. And then it's not that hard to do alone. And I really think for this person, that's the switch. Like training alone is just not going to work for her anymore.
Yeah, but I would add nuance to that. Or if you're like used to it. Meaning, like, it's not that you can train alone and not have a void, Like, I can train alone and go ham because, like, I've been doing it for 20 years.
Can I push back on that and ask you a question, Steve? Because I know you, I think as well as anyone but your wife. I know that you can do that and you can turn it on. But if I asked you, Steve, to really train up for a half marathon for a 6-month cycle, you don't think that you would enjoy it more and do better if you found a training group to do that in versus doing it alone?
I mean, I don't think the question is about enjoyment. Like, of course, it's always like funner to be on a team. But like, if you asked me, for instance, this last year, if you said, hey, Steve, go get train for a half marathon while being a part of a team, I'd probably be like, well, I can't do that because like our lifestyle and having a 1-year-old necessitates that I train during this time frame to give myself both the opportunity to train and my wife opportunity to train. So I can't do that. So I think that, like, yes, I would always suggest people to do things together. I think my point is that just because you go at it alone doesn't mean that like you're filling some sort of void. For some, it's literally like brushing your teeth,
Yeah, and that gets back to, I guess, what your drivers are. Because for me, I could train longer if I did it alone, because then I would just train in my basement and I'd save the commute time and this chat time, which add it all up, it's like 40 minutes. But I think what's better for me as an athlete is to do the commute and to do the chat at the gym, because I know that when there's other people around me, especially if they're the same people most of the time, my motivation's just better. Whereas if I train alone in the basement for like 2 weeks, I crush it and I get in these big workouts. Then by week 3, I'm like, why am I doing this? This makes no sense. It's just figuring out what the right tool is for the right moment in the right season of life.
One way we might bring this to a close, I think, is because, we're talking about motivation and identity and when to shift away from what you've been doing. And I thought that Eliud Kipchoge's comments, about his marathon performance, which we have circulated in the Growth Equation text thread, were interesting and sort of tie into this conversation we're having. So for people who didn't watch Paris Marathon, Steve, you're going to be way more of an expert here than I am, so correct me if I'm wrong. But Kipchoge, he 2-time defending Olympic champion in the marathon, obviously probably the greatest marathoner of all time. Is that fair to say, Steve? And he sort of fell off, I believe, in the first half of the race. And then at like 18, 19 miles, 31 kilometers for metric system people, he dropped out of the race because he had back pain. And afterwards, he gave some comments about it, and he said, quote, "Today was a tough day at the office. You can train for a very long time, but one day it can happen." I get it, meaning DNFs. He did not finish the race. And he said, "It's like boxing. You can go to a training camp for 5 months and be knocked out in 2 seconds, but life will continue. This is my worst marathon. I've never done a DNF. That's life. Like a boxer, I've been knocked down. I've won. I've come 2nd, 8th, 10th, 5th. Now I did not finish. That's life." If you know Kipchoge, he's sort of this type of person who often drops nuggets of wisdom like this. But I thought that was just really interesting perspective. And it's nice to see when someone like Courtney Dauwalter, who's at the top of their level, at the top of their sport, and able to maintain such a balanced and wise perspective.
My reaction was just what a wise sage and great athlete. And to toot our own horn for a minute, a real moment of pride, because Kipchoge's been a long time reader of the Growth Equation, of the books, follows us on Twitter. Like he's been with us on this ride, and we've pulled from him. He's heavily quoted in our work. And it's just incredible to cheer for someone. And I actually sent Elliot a quick message after the race, not that he needed to hear it from me, but essentially letting him know that even though the day didn't unfold how he wanted, I'm going to watch that video of him essentially pulling up and losing, and then walking with fans and giving his shirt away, his shoes away with my young kids many, many times, because the lessons that will teach them about how to be the best and how to lose with grace is every bit as important as if he would have won that race. Easy to say and philosophize in the moment when you've trained for 4 years to do this, when it's probably your last go at the Olympics, to have that happen and not just to pull over in a puddle of tears and get into the cart and have him drive you off the course, that's like really hard to do. And he did it. So I just have nothing but admiration for Elliot. And in a crazy metaphor, maybe we'll look back on that moment and say that by taking off his running shirt and giving it to the fans, he's taking off that part of his identity and evolving into something new. So I don't know. We don't know him that well. It's not like we talk to him all the time, but just huge fan and was a real special moment. So that's my take. Steve, what about you?
Just to add context really quick, Brad's talking about after he dropped out, he walked for a while and fans flocked to him because obviously running fans are know very well who he is. And he gave him his jersey, he gave him his shoes. By the time he got off, I think he was just basically wearing shorts. And it was, you sometimes see basketball players throw wristbands in the crowd occasionally, but to see Elliot give away his shoes and his shirt that way was very cool.
And after a terrible performance, I think that's what matters. I think you often see the basketball players hang out with the fans and throw their stuff in the crowd when they win. Imagine losing a championship and sticking around to do that. And that's what Elliot did. He's special.
He's a special one, and I think it perfectly exemplifies how he approaches running and life. And in many ways, as Brad echoed, that makes it even more meaningful. I don't know. Elliot's always got a special place in my heart because we're essentially the exact same age. So he was, I think, born in November. I was in October of dating myself, 1984, which means when I was a high schooler and at my peak, I remember looking at the world junior rankings, which is, under 20, right? And I think I was in the mile, number 3 or 4 in the mile in the world for juniors or whatever, high school age kids. And I thought I was pretty good. And then I looked at the 5K list and Elliot, same age, ran like 12:50 something. And I was like, holy crap, that's 4:0 some pace per mile, essentially. Like, this guy's on another level. He's been someone that I've watched race from afar for 20 plus years. And it's just so impressive how he does it. And I think his longevity is a testament to his approach, because tying it into what we've talked about now, I have no doubt that like how he saw sport as an 18-year-old is probably different than how he sees it as a 39-year-old. But his motivation ebbed, flowed. I'm sure his identity around running shifted, changed. But like, what didn't change? He was always among the best in the world in the approach that he took, and doing it in a way that I think is extremely admirable.
It's been a great conversation, fellas. I've really enjoyed it. Listeners, something important for you all. If you want to be your best, maybe the best in the world at what you do, who can say? We never know our ceiling until we try. And you want to go deeper on these topics, be sure to check out our new Academy for Human Performance. We've now launched for a little bit over a month, got over 250 members. And in the Academy for Human Performance, we've got exclusive masterclasses, we've got a book club, monthly seminars, and we go deep on all of these topics in live discussion forums. So the topic of identity, that has been an ongoing conversation in the Academy with people sharing how they've flipped the switch through different stages of their life. Eliud Kipchoge, granted, it happened at about 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Eastern time, so it wasn't live. But by the next morning, the Academy forum was buzzing with pictures of him retiring from that race and conversation about what it means and how he did it. So if you want a more interactive place to go deeper on everything that we talk about in this podcast, to support the Growth Equation and to support your own development and performance, could not recommend the Growth Equation Academy for Human Performance more. It has essentially replaced my social media use elsewhere, and I think that you might find the same. So it'll be in the show notes. If you haven't joined yet, check it out. We'd love to have you in the community. And with that, we'll catch you next week. So farewell.
Almost nailed the tagline, Brad. It's, as always, farewell.
So with that, we'll catch you next week. And channeling my best Clay Skipper, as always, farewell.